My name is Adrienne Galley, and I'm a Humanitarian Collaborative Practitioner Fellow at the University of Virginia's Global Policy Center and a visiting scholar in the Department of English. Environmental Humanities at Scale is organized by Environmental Humanities at UVA, and my colleagues Charlotte Rogers, convener of Environmental Humanities, and Enrico Cesaretti, both in the Department of Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, and Mary Kuhn in the Department of English. We launched the series last year through generous funding from the English department at UVA and included panels on water justice, plant diaspora, climate migration, and genders for the Anthropocene. We're very grateful to our funders for making a second year of this series possible, the Institute for the Humanities and Global Cultures and the Page Barber Endowment. EH at Scale invites scholars who are thinking creatively and flexibly with issues of scale in their work, and the series is driven by three core questions. What kinds of environmental thought are necessary in an age of planetary crisis? How might we think flexibly across scales, temporal, geographic, and geological, to understand the manifold implications of climate change? How do questions of scale affect strategies for pursuing environmental justice? As we look ahead to our third panel in this year's series, please mark your calendars for March 24th for our panel on emotions, islands, and crises. And if you missed our most recent panel on waste and toxicity, the recording will be available on the EH at UVA website very soon. Finally, I want to thank the EH and Institute for the Humanities and Global Cultures graduate assistants, Sam Jacob and Isabel Ostertag, for their help in organizing today's event. Our panelists today are Stephanie Clare and Catherine Yusof, and I will introduce them and invite them to speak in alphabetical order. Stephanie Clare is an associate professor in the English department at the University of Washington, Seattle. She works in feminist, queer, and trans studies in more than human worlds at the intersection of phenomenologies and the Anthropocene. Her recent book is Earthly Encounters: Sensation, Feminist Theory, and the Anthropocene, which explores specific kinds of sensation, such as extreme cold, immersion in water, and containment, and how they are unevenly distributed within social worlds and productive of racial, ethnic, national, and gendered subjectivities. Her next book, Non-Binary Women, A Feminist Auto Theory, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. Catherine Yusof is professor of Inhuman Geography at Queen Mary, University of London. Her work focuses on dynamic Earth events such as abrupt climate change, biodiversity loss, and extinction. She's interested in how these Earth revolutions impact social thought. Broadly, her work is focused on political aesthetics, social theory, and abrupt environmental change. Her recent book is A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, and her current research addresses questions of geologic life within the proposed geologic epoch of the Anthropocene. It examines how inhuman and non-organic dimensions of life have consequences for how we understand issues of fossil fuels, human-Earth relations, and materiality in the politics of life. Professor Yusof's work draws on insights from contemporary feminist philosophy, critical human geography, and the earth sciences. She's particularly interested in the opportunities the Anthropocene presents for rethinking the interactions between the earth sciences and human geography and the quote-unquote geosocial formations of anthropogenic change. Now, both scholars have redirected our attention in highly generative ways to bodies in the Anthropocene. Working across scales is integral to their work, which reminds us in salutary ways that bodies are inextricable from all other scales of thought. Both write of bodies as the sites, repositories, and vectors of power relations, and are as at the core of planetary thinking now. In her book, Earthly Encounters, Clare engages with a history of phenomenology from Merleau-Ponty to Fanon to analyze bodily sensations through feminist, queer, and racialized subjectivities as crucial to Anthropocene thinking. Yusof's A Billion Black Anthropocenes defies the, quote, givenness of geology as innocent or natural description of the world, unquote, and fundamentally reframes the geologic as the strata of extractivist racialized relations of power. Thinking Blackness in terms of geologic life means rejecting human-inhuman binaries, marshaling materialities, always embodied relations, is embedded in and extricable from the colonial theft of extractivism, and centering critical Black aesthetics as at the core of any account of, quote unquote, the earth. I'm going to turn now to our panelists who will present their remarks, and I will then invite them to respond to each other, and I'll respond very briefly myself before opening the floor to questions and comments. This series is very much based around a model of conversation, so we do invite you to use the Q&A box to engage with our speakers throughout their talks and at the end. Professor Claire, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that introduction. Welcome, everyone. I posted to Sam the link to a Google Doc that that's going to be my presentation. So I know some people like to read along. Sam, were you able to share it? Because I can't share it. There we go, to everyone. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So there it is. This talk is like brand new stuff that I was hoping to expand, that I hope to expand on and write an essay based on it. But this is just the beginning. So breathing the Anthropocene. Breathing is inevitably morbid. So reads the first sentence of Jean-Thomas Tremblay's recent monograph, Breathing Aesthetics. It is morbid because, he argues, to be a breather is to be vulnerable. As long as we breathe and as long as we're porous, we cannot fully shield ourselves from airborne toxins and toxicants, as well as other ambient threats. When I first read these sentences of Tremblay's, I understood them as hopelessly masculinist. They seemed tied to conceptions of the self-sufficient individual and dependent upon a mode of thinking that sees boundaries and containment as necessary for safety. I was even ready to argue that this figuration of breathing is carceral, in that it upholds enclosure, in this case, the containment of the body, and its walls in the name of supposed safety. None of this was exactly fair. Tremblay does acknowledge that while breathing is inevitably morbid, he also wants it, needs it to be life-giving and life-affirming as well. He also recognizes that there's no singular respiratory subject. Based on our social positionalities, we're differently exposed to different air. Nonetheless, to begin with breathing's morbidity, as he does, seems to assume a pure self, a body that is somehow shielded from the world. Such an imaginary purity, maintained in separation, seems characteristic of whiteness and its false universalization. Instead, I want to begin with the fact that our body's porosity is necessary to our vitality, a vitality that only exists in our interconnectedness to and on this planet. Recently, like many others, I've become preoccupied with breath. During the summer of 2020, Eric Garner's dying words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying cry in the protests against police brutality and anti-Blackness in the United States. The phrase reverberated in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The airborne virus produced respiratory distress. This was a pandemic of the breath. Garner's phrase also echoed Frantz Fanon's description of the colonized, stifling sense of containment produced by colonization. That containment, Fanon wrote, leads to muscle tension, a pseudo-petrification, death in life and life in death, holding one's breath, which is to say not breathing. For myself, a settler here living on Coast Salish lands, October 2022 brought my own crisis of breath. Seattle, where I live, was experiencing unprecedented fall heat. It was in the 80s Fahrenheit, as opposed to the average 50s. And the city was blanketed in thick smoke from wildfires that were burning atypically on the wetter west side of the nearby Cascade Mountains. My dog refused to go outside. My daughter refused to go to school. The smoke gave her a headache, made her feel nauseated. She was scared, she kept saying. The hummingbirds who usually feed outside of my home office window were nowhere to be seen. The smoke made up our atmosphere, an affective and material milieu. It signaled clearly that all was not well. It made us disoriented in space and in time. What season was this? What time of day was it? Where was the sun? And in our bodies. Accompanied by the hum of air purifiers, we breathed lightly, but the shallow breath felt like panic. Matter and meaning, body and mind entwined over and again. October 2022 was especially difficult for me because I had had COVID just a few months earlier and I still had trouble breathing. The smoke exacerbated my symptoms and wearing a mask became incredibly difficult. I would start gagging whenever I put one on. On one of these October mornings, as the concentration of particulates in the air continued to rise, I found myself unsure about how I would make it to campus. I couldn't stomach burning more fossil fuels and drive to work, so I biked as usual. But the air was unhealthy for all groups. Halfway there, my wheezing turned into a cough, which turned into vomit. I somehow made it to class on time, but I have no idea what I did when I got there. A common refrain in early scholarship on the Anthropocene, or the racial capitalist scene, as I tend to prefer, is that this geologic era cannot be experienced. The scale of the Anthropocene is discordant with the scale of human experience, both temporally and spatially. The result, as for instance, Tobias Bose puts it, Tobias Bose puts it, is that at best we can hope for, quote, partial mediation by the victims of local manifestations of such planetary force, by hurricane survivors, or farmers whose livelihoods have been taken away by droughts or rising temperatures, or families displaced by flooding, for instance. However, he continues, quote, the gap between this merely local knowledge and comprehensive understanding of the planetary condition is vast. As a feminist scholar, such claims have always seemed suspect to me. It is true that this argument about scale has been strategic. Climate change denialism has often mobilized personal experience to discard claims of earthly transformation. So it makes sense that environmentalists and climate scientists would then insist on the distinction between climate and weather, between the scale of climate and the scale of weather, and later between the scale of geology and the scale of individual human experience. And yet, at the same time, I've been troubled by many of these claims about the discordance between the scale of the Anthropocene and the scale of experience, between comprehensive understanding, to use Bo's words on the one hand, and local knowledge on the other. As Catherine Yusof argues, selective perspectivism and the voidings of experiences have become inherent in Anthropocene discourse. Such discourse seems to privilege the view from nowhere, the disembodied viewpoint of privilege, and it falsely imagines experiences unmediated, as though our knowledge of, say, climate change or our knowledge of Anthropocene does not change how we actually experience the world. In Seattle, smoke season has become a new norm, though watching ash gently float to the ground never feels normal. As I breathe in the smoke, I am experiencing the Anthropocene. In fact, the Anthropocene is not exterior to my body. I breathe it in, and as I do, I become a creature of this era. But how should these creatures, different from one another as they are, live? The University of Washington, where I teach, offers no protocols, no guidelines about how to proceed in the smoke. In contrast, even though in the past 6 years we have fewer snowstorms than days of smoke, at the beginning of each winter, we are reminded of general guidelines about possible closures due to snow. During the smoke season this October, some of my colleagues wrote to our faculty-wide listserv, calling upon administrators to, if not suggest protocols, at least to acknowledge that the air was unhealthy for all of us, and to recognize how structural inequality and disability meant that the effects of the smoke were unevenly distributed amongst students, faculty, and staff. The response to my colleagues was swift. Where is your resilience? This is no big deal. Keep calm, carry on. As an educator, I certainly did not want to tell my students to suck it up. I kept thinking of Ben Okri, the Nigerian British poet and novelist, who writes that we can only make a future from the depth of the truth we face now. We needed to face what we were facing, but then what? And this is my more speculative ending here. Freedom, Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes, is a place. That is, to be free, to exercise freedom requires space, access to spatiality, and to elements of the earth. People make freedom, Gilmore writes, provisionally, imperatively, as they imagine home against the disintegrating grind of racial capitalism. What is freedom in the racial capitalist scene? Within the smoke, where are its multi-species places? If, following Anna Singh, we understand the Anthropocene as a period during which there exists few places of refuge for people and other critters, does this suggest that the condition of freedom, understood as a place-making capacity, has shrunk? Or perhaps in the racial capitalist scene, might we abandon freedom as a value and turn instead to a practice of care? Not a controlling, colonizing care, but a practice that is humble and attentive. A practice of maintaining, continuing, repairing, and also contributing to our world so that we can live in it as best as possible. In fact, all our freedoms, writes Deepesh Chakrabarty, have been petrol heavy. Within the context of our present neoliberal necroecologies, by which I mean in the context of an ongoing pandemic, within the context of pervasive racial discrimination and disinvestment, in the context of ecological devastation and the continued attachment to market logics to judge all worth, we need more care, better care. We need to develop, in the words of Hobart and Nice, a vital set of underappreciated strategies for enduring precarious worlds. For me, in a smoky classroom, this will mean listening to students' stories, to make space to think through climate grief, and to make space to consider and notice the effects, for instance, of the smoke on the multiple species with which we live. Ideally, in this space, we might create a temporary, albeit imperfect, refuge from one another, creatures of the Anthropocene, whom we have become. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just hand it directly over to you, Catherine, to give your piece as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Lots to talk about there. I just wanted to think a bit from the book that I just finished around geologic life in the Anthropocene, and think about this kind of concept of geologic life. And that's really about thinking about bodies as earth systems and one of the social stratums in earth processes. And like we can figure this, I think at the moment, as racial capitalism, as Stephanie mentioned, but it might also be more properly historically named as colonial geology, as a set of practices that emerged to kind of produce a certain kind of form of earth transformation. So I want to think about addressing differentiation and aggregation in the geosocial body as a kind of historical, situated political and environmental state. So a kind of state of being rather than a kind of scalar state. So if we think about earth bodies as these kind of geosocial aggregates that participate in and are vulnerable to inhuman intimacy and to the kind of violence of the earth as variously configured, they're also differentiated social bodies that act on and change planetary geologic states. So the kind of change of epoch, which we call the Anthropocene. So we can think about earth bodies, but we might think about more specifically as earthed bodies. So bodies that are a transmission force to and through the earth. So with historically differentiating and raced access to and subjugation of geopower. And this might be something that we pick up together in a moment. So in this attunement to differentiation, the question comes, whose bodies are earthed, whose bodies are connected to the earth or subjected to having to develop what I think of as tactics of the earthbound. So an alternative set of epistemologies that respond to the kind of impact of inhuman intimacy as a political act, but also a tool of environmental knowledge-making practices which configure towards freedom. And we can see this in the sort of longue durée of environmental practices against kind of subjugating conditions. Those are kind of tactics that are developed in the confines or the carceralities of intimacy, but ultimately about kind of moving towards the creation of other spaces, and indeed so kind of engaging with environmental knowledge as a kind of key tactic in that kind of resistance. So if we think about different kinds of earthing, attachment, being held towards and intimate with a particular kind of proximity to earth materials or events, this is kind of one route out of the imperial objectification of the earth, the kind of scale up. So it's also a way of moving against the normative languages of materiality, the earth in particular, homogenizing ways. So say the language of natural resources, which we can see as a kind of a normative language of materiality. And it also kind of points attention to thinking about the geologic as a medium of shifts. So a kind of shifting terrain in politics. And I think we can begin to see this in the kind of materialization of politics through kind of the professional posts that are being kind of created essentially around water, heat, fire. So we've got this kind of emergence of elemental ministers, in a sense, that are kind of being starting to deal with states of the earth as rather than kind of particular estates of the earth. So seeing bodies as and in geochemistry and subject to geophysical effects, in turn kind of affects planetary states. And here I just want to kind of a word of caution around a kind of return to an indifferent elemental determinism. So I think there's lots of work going on now around the elemental, and perhaps we also need to kind of think this in terms of differentiation, not as a kind of some sort of pure state, as you alerted us to, Stephanie. So this is a way, I think, to aggregate scale without reproducing its sort of depolitical effects. So understanding bodies as implicated in geochemistry and seeing the geologic as a medium of social struggle allows us to shift the focus from a kind of scalar perspective to a temporal one, which is to see time rather than spatial dynamics per se as a really important domain of Anthropocene politics. So if questions of scale are not inherently spatial, but involve temporalities and the politics of geologic time, and I think the politics of geologic time are also the politics of race, because geology and race are co-natal in colonialism, and they share this origination in the discipline of geology and the classification and differentiation of matter, and these kind of geologics of colonial materialism as kind of subject positions, so as kind of inhuman, dehumanized kind of positions that also configure two states of matter. So the temporality of race is organized in relation to colonialism and capitalism and to these trajectories of time. And we can think here about progressive or white settler time and the imposition of that time on other kind of racialized subjects. And specifically, I think the ongoing material determinism of cultural and economic development through extraction. So the extraction buys you the privilege of white time, which is this kind of neo-colonial mythology that has been the kind of hard sell to decolonial countries. So the trajectory of time organizes these kind of permissible forms of futurity, of settler futurism, white supremacy claimed through a degradation of non-extraction, and the organization of these kind of monotemporalities of global world space that have accumulated really in the material legacy of the Anthropocene. So we can think colonial Earth and white geology is Anthropocene Earth. And settler futurity is organized through these kind of historic geographies of uneven environments and their racialized modes of extraction and depletion, or the kind of racial deficits they set up. So time in the underground feeds the overgrounds of urban modernity, and the time of the earthbound is time in racial deficit, so doing time for promotion into the surface flows of capital. So we think, if we return and kind of think about the sort of non-reproduction of harm in terms of these kind of geotraumas, and part of an ongoing colonial modality, this involves displacing the normative and reproductive modes of carbon-intense forms of geologic life that organize futurity through a racialized praxis. So in terms of thinking about giving bodies a different future, we also need to kind of think about how they're implicated in the kind of reproduction of certain forms of environmental practice and knowledge. So if we think with geologic life, it's a way of kind of apprehending the earth as a kind of praxis of exchange across temporal scales and through these material states that are political states, but also epochal states, states of being, and racialized states. So I think this is most relevant in the aggregation of racial geophysics, where kind of historic racial forces combine with contemporary structures of exposure to create geophysical conditions of race, and the politics of racialized poor as kind of both epistemic and extractive. So beyond kind of sites of environmental justice, in a sense, that the legacy of these kind of sets of geologic forces operate through a kind of a historic geophysical state. So we can think kind of geologic life as an analytic that positions inhuman forces in political terms as proceeding by political concepts of life, and understanding changes of state as a kind of political domain and a racial access. So thinking with a sort of dynamic environment, forces us to begin to think about some of these things like kind of racialized pressures, or the kind of weight and climates of kind of space, which inherently kind of temporal dynamics. I think it's probably enough to get going with.
I just wasn't sure if you were pausing or ending, but that's terrific. Thank you so much. Well, you've both given us a lot to think with, and I think I like that your talks were operating at different, let's say, theoretical and sort of epistemological scales as well, which was very nice. So I wonder if I would just invite you to, maybe if you have a question or just a very brief response to each other's papers, that we maybe start with that, and then I'll jump in with a few comments before we open it up to questions.
I do have a question. Yeah. So it's just like, thank you. You gave me loads to think about. And I wanted to better understand, though, how is it that thinking of like Earth bodies or bodies as Earth systems gets us to think about the scale of temporality? I think I missed. Yeah. Could you help me to understand? And then what's at stake, or like what, that seems to be opening something up for you. And I'm curious if you could help me to understand that.
I think kind of part of the shift is a move away from kind of biologism and biopolitics and the kind of configuration of a kind of bounded biological body, and to really kind of situate the body in its kind of prehistory of geology. So kind of all those kind of, biological actions of power on the body emerge from a geologic context. And it's only by this kind of separation of geology and biology that kind of, in a sense, the action of race can exist, because it stabilizes the sort of interregnum between those two things. So by thinking about bodies as sort of Earth systems is a way to, in some ways, kind of open up that division between the human and the inhuman to its historical context, to the forms of subjugation and transformation of the Earth that have been integral to how certain bodies have been elevated. So one of the things I think about is like what allows whiteness to float. And in some ways, what allows kind of white bodies to float above the Earth in a conceptual, but also in a kind of material way, because they're not down the mine necessarily, or kind of. So what is it that, in terms of these different geophysics, that allows a kind of a certain racial movement through the world? Does that help clarify?
It super helps clarify. Thank you. I really, yeah. Can I ask a follow-up? Is that all right?
Certainly.
Right,
yeah.
Yeah. And then in that clarification, the separation between the geologic and the biological is what allows for race to emerge, or racism, I guess. The discourse of race, let's say. Can you help me understand that? Because it's so interesting and compelling.
Well, this is partly to do with kind of history of geology. That there's a moment in kind of colonialism, geologists are both kind of codifying land through these kind of geologics, but they're also codifying bodies through racial logics. And those two things are they're the same encounter. So with kind of earth and bodies. And race becomes the thing that allows the human to be separated from the inhuman, because it holds those two things together while allowing them to be separate. So it stabilizes that kind of, because it's completely illogical in one way to separate the inhuman from the human, right? Because like we breathe in worlds, as you just have been talking about. So it's like, it doesn't make sense in terms of kind of split, but it only makes sense through this kind of way in which race becomes the kind of way to glue it together, but also to allow it to operate, so the privileged, Winter's privileged human gets to operate in a set of material practices through the kind of through this kind of join of race, which also puts the racialized poor in the mine that kind of supports the very kind of organization of colonial bodies and settler kind of futurity. There's obviously a lot more complex steps in between, but I think that's, for me, that's the kind of, it allows those things to be separated but held together. But it also creates this kind of racial deficit model in terms of materialism. So materialism is always raced, even when it doesn't have a raced subject that it's operating on. Which might be a nice way to, one of the things that I was thinking in terms of your presentation and around the kind of discourse of the Anthropocene more generally is just the kind of ableism around the Anthropocene. And I was wondering whether you could say more about that. But I was also having a slightly sneaky thought in terms of when you're thinking about refuge and what it means to have a spatial enclosure, because then immediately I started thinking about white bros kind of making refuge, making bunkers, and the whole sort of paleo movement and all these kind of, which is like the paleo body is this kind of. So I was thinking about all those things alongside a kind of refuge of care and so on, and how we put those two speculative futures together, and maybe how ableism might help us connect those.
So interesting. Yeah, thank you for those questions. I think the question about refuge is the problem of the politics of care, which is to say that on the one hand, I find some of that, some of that like feminist scholarship, early scholarship on care is like incredibly heteronormative and centered on like white family structures, et cetera. I don't want to uphold that part of it, but I do find like the kind of not having the basic moral principles in particular situations and attentiveness to another, I find that really productive and like also is an important part of like of rejecting ableism, right? Mm-hmm. And insisting that we are connected to one another and dependent upon one another, and that dependency is not is something we shouldn't shy away from. So I find the politics of care helpful and interesting. I like the forms of subjectivity it imagines. And yet care has been used to create walls and and borders, and it's like in the name of care that we see like limits of like trans kids health care, for instance, under the name of care. So you're right, you're really right to bring attention to like the problem. And what I find interesting about my talk in relation to your question was that I start with the problem of enclosure and like look at how like this scholar is seeing like the enclosed body as a site of like refuge, really. And I was like, no, we're connected. But then I end up thinking about refuge myself. So maybe the thing about a politics of care is it's not a politics of purity, and it needs to be one that's constantly considering its limits and constantly transforming to the specific situations and people who might be gathered and responsive, so that yeah, but I don't think I have the best answer though yet. You know, it's one to think of. We need refuge to live, right?
Mhm.
We need it. We can share it.
Yeah, I mean, I was just like where you started, which like, you know, seemed to indicate that you were kind of leaning into the concept of vulnerability, and then it just made me think, okay, what is the, like, what does that lean in consist of? Like, what's kind of politically at stake in vulnerability, and how does it?
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
it is for sure about, so I'm sorry, I just interrupted you.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I mean, for sure, for me, what is politically at stake? I mean, I was so angry when the university responded and was like, you know, keep calm, carry on, basically. It was like, be resilient. And I mean, for sure, it is not recognizing, I mean, it's completely ableist, right? Obviously. And then also it doesn't consider like effects of environmental racism on people's bodies, and like, so uneven people, like the levels of asthma are completely racialized, for example. So I think that like recognizing vulnerability, I think that to not see vulnerability is to be from a position of power that dismisses people's experiences and realities and bodies. And so for me, what is at stake in leaning into vulnerability is about facing the situation that we're actually in, as opposed to just allowing may the strongest survive. I mean, right? Survival of the fittest. So that is the lean into vulnerability there, I think. Yeah.
So thank you both so much for those incredibly generative talks, and also for the kind of, you know, starting the conversation between yourselves. I just want to try and sort of think across different connections in your pieces a little bit. I think thinking about the, you know, the idea of the construction of whiteness as a bounded body, right, and the construction of the non-white body as the intensely porous, is sort of is already sort of experientially breaking down for so many, right, in the moment of the kind of felt experience of climate through wildfires, flooding, and all sorts of phenomena that are erupting into the sensory experiences of all different subjectivities, right? But what I sort of am trying to think about is both kind of holding the idea of the sort of crisis privilege that many people in certain class and raced positions still hold, despite the you know, let's say proof otherwise of the intense vulnerability of their own bodies, and try and connect that a little bit to Catherine, your idea of these sort of temporalities, sort of moving away from biopolitics and into this sort of longer temporality of how bodies are situated in a geologic time, and just sort of ask you to think through a little bit about envisioning the body as a praxis that exceeds one's own historical individualized body, right? And is kind of going into a much longer history of bodily orientations, positionality, and sort of imposed confines or porosity. Because I think that one of the challenges is, you know, one of the challenges of this series is you're moving across scales conceptually in which the political, the social, the cultural, and the sort of deeper time temporality of all of those categories and how they are inherited sort of comes up against sort of immediate phenomenologies that then can be dismissed within the logic of those inheritances. And so I'm just wondering, like, how you're thinking about just something like who can go inside, right, cuts across these different ways of thinking that would move us away from a biopolitics into something that would be more temporally oriented, and that temporality immediately connects us to Earth systems, which I think is what you're trying to say. Is that right?
Catherine, would you like to start?
I'm just thinking about that, actually. I'm thinking about the I mean, I think the construction of the white body is kind of, you know, that also kind of is in increasing positions of precarity is a construction of a sort of ideation of a kind of exemplar body, or a kind of a sort of ideal manifestation of a kind of a set of non-relations, essentially, to the earth.
Yeah.
Of a kind of, you know, a body that will resist and kind of, you know, become muscular around kind of the earth rather than sort of be subjected to it. So I think part of thinking about kind of sort of geohistories, and then kind of, and a sort of a long geomorphology of racializing and racial forms. And those, I think, are they're about kind of subject forms, but they're also about place forms, right? Relationships to land and kind of environments and so on. And they have lots of complex multi-ethnic formations now. I think, you know, it's like stepping into whiteness you don't necessarily need, you know, that's a multi-ethnic affair in terms of geologic practices. But I think what I'm trying to get at is that we can't think about how race matters outside of geology, and therefore we can't think about environments without thinking about the mattering of race as a kind of collective, socially kind of policed and epistemically situated condition of racialization that is produced through materiality and material forms. So to me, there's no such thing as identity outside of materiality. Like there's no kind of ideology of materiality, ideology of identity that is not at once kind of earthed in a particular way. And so I think maybe kind of how we intervene in those politics is also to not accept a kind of form of identity politics that is not grounded in the earth, that is not kind of talking about the way in which bodies are earthed and kind of participating in these kinds of forms of material. And I think that's what the sort of populist kind of identity politics tries to do, is dematerialize, you know, socially collective bodies. So it didn't quite answer your question, but maybe it gets at some of the sort of nuances of how to think about geology in the context of a body.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in the idea of moving away from the theoretical constructs of the biopower, of the biopolitical, as not sufficient, right, for this particular kind of conceptual historical moment, what it would require. And I think that that's a really interesting move. And I just sort of want to I want to kind of bring in some of the questions that are being asked by the audience too, because I don't want to use up, I could continue to ask questions, but I want to let other people ask questions. So we have a question from Maxia saying, could you both open up about expressions or possibilities of relief? Are there ecologies, aesthetics, social practices, geological formations, or otherwise, in which you're seeing us make and unmake possibilities of refuge or perhaps relief, whether material or beyond? Thank you for your critical attention.
Do you want to take that one, Stephanie? I think it might be sort of directed towards you.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard because there's so much, right? And I'm just thinking of all these different artworks and like, but I think, let me try to. I've been interested in the conversation that we've been having in the focus on bodies and on geologic bodies and not accepting an identity politics not related to the earth. I think that's like super interesting and compelling. And at the same time, I end up wondering what the framework of bodies might miss, because I think we're body subjects and we produce things and create things and imagine things. And of course, that's all embodied. It's totally embodied. But I am interested in the place of subjectivity. And so one of the things that, like, when I was working through this talk, and I'm still not sure how to do it in a way that would be productive, but I was thinking a lot alongside Saidia Hartman's work on what's the Beautiful Lives, Creative Experiments, and also like Christina Sharp's work in The Wake. And Sharp describes like an experience of her mother. So they're living in the conditions of anti-Blackness, living in a household that has also like domestic violence, but the mother finding moments of beauty, bringing in a flower and creating it, and like, you know, and just putting it out, and this is a moment of refuge, says Sharp, that it's not just that her body was always within this condition of anti-Blackness or always just being like, you know, vulnerable or open, but there's a creative, there are moments of creation and of the aesthetic. Really, it is a moment of the aesthetic and of a care practice, right? It's a relationship between a mother and a daughter that exceeds the power relations that are all around them. And I think that in some ways, so I don't want to, the work of, there's so much scholarship, or Black feminism is often turned to, and like Black women writers have been turned to in the past few years to like provide the answers, right? And we're gonna have the anti-racist book club. Like, let's go read these Black women and we're gonna solve the problem. Hey, white people, let's read these books. And I think that I'm trying to figure out how to engage with this like Black feminist scholarship in a way that's not appropriative, and as well in a way that doesn't recognize the very specificity that they are responding to. Because I don't want to say, well, actually, look, this gives us an answer about this possibility of relief within the Anthropocene, you know. At the same time, I think that there's so much wisdom there that has been hard earned and gained, and that deserves attentiveness and attention, and that can teach us all a lot. So that's my best answer so far to those questions. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're saying that, you know, it is one thing to recognize the sort of the geological element of that is inextricable from the racialized body. But when you look at it from the perspective of subjectivity as a category, we must acknowledge that people are not just, you know, to paraphrase another scholar, people are not just objects of ruin, right? That there is a way into feelings, states of being that are not participating in reproducing a kind of fantasy, right, of subjectivity, but that are still, and that are not participating in the logics of resilience with all of the incredibly problematic apolitical sort of non-differentiated language that attends that, but also understands that you know, we don't have to reproduce an autonomous Enlightenment subject to have people not be objects of ruin. I want to ask one more question from Lloyd Tsai. Since this question originally is for Stephanie, but probably also relates to what Catherine has to say. Thanks so much for your words, which were very moving. Near the end, you discussed the links between freedom and space, that is the necessity of having space to have freedom, but also suggests moving away from freedom towards an ethics of care. I'm wondering if you could say more about how you're thinking with these themes in conjunction with indigeneity, with native claims to land and native ethics that foster broadly environmental care instead of environmental extraction. Is the move from freedom to care best framed as an Indigenous one? Thank you.
Yeah. Great question. Thank you for the question. I've been thinking a lot with my colleague Megan Ibarra in the geography department here, who has written exactly on this question of like freedom and care in relation to indigeneity. And how is that I want to respond to this question? I think we also have to, I think, yes, of course, there are indigenous epistemologies that understand human bodies as entangled with more than human worlds and dependent upon those worlds. I think that sometimes we get the language of care there, but we also get like responsibility, and we also get duties, and we also get like it's not exactly or only the language of care. So that would be the first thing I would say. And that maybe it would be worth looking to see the ways in which specifically it is, discussed, which is not the best answer. I'm trying to think of. I mean, I guess I'm thinking about rights, like events in response. So the salmon are coming back, right? And we can start to fish for the salmon. We're going to fish for the salmon. I think this is a Coast Salish practice where you thank the salmon. So it's not that the salmon is not taken and eaten, right? And it's not just care for the salmon either, but it's acknowledging one's relationship to the earth and to more than humans, and acknowledging some form of reciprocity or relationality. So I guess maybe what I'm saying is that I think that I find myself, I don't want to just romanticize Native and Indigenous epistemologies and practices. I think that that's a settler practice that has long not gotten us anywhere. And yet I'm interested in different practices of creating refuge and creating space and freedom in Indigenous worlds at the same time. So yeah.
Maybe I can jump in and just kind of pick up on, if we think about what we were just talking about, kind of aesthetics as a practice, or a kind of geophysics of resistance, a countergravity to forces of kind of oppression, and to a way to create worlds within worlds that we can also kind of, and for me, a shortcut for thinking about this is like how to have a rock in the family, which is kind of Indigenous practices around like sort of whereas Enlightenment colonial practices are you can't have a rock in the family. So if we begin to think kind of around these sort of epistemological structures, but also these are aesthetic structures, right? They're also kind of kin, kind of care, relational. So maybe that's another way to think about kind of futurity without like reproduction in a sense, or a different kind of reproduction, or it starts to sort of queer across a whole different set of ways in which we think about being earthed in the world. And it's that you can have a rock in the family in Indigenous kind of epistemologies. So that's a way to maybe rethink how we both do kind of genealogy and sort of decolonizing genealogy, but also thinking about a kind of a future that can contain different sets of relations that are necessary to the configuration of any form of existence.
I think that's a great, we only have a few minutes left, so I would encourage you to put a final question in the chat box if you have one that's burning and you have been holding it all this time. But I think maybe if there isn't another question, I have one in thinking about futurity, because I think one of the big questions that is lurking in the background of both of these talks is a sense of futurity, multiple futurities, when we're thinking temporally, and when we're thinking in terms of a body whose historical import exceeds its corporeal, right, bounded existence, that we need to think in terms of possible forms of futurity that are not going to be replicating, the problematic, either colonial, white geological, or kind of the conceptual idea of the non-bounded, non-relational body. And so I guess what I would ask you is, one of the challenges that I think through in all the time is that we often don't have very good words for the relationalities that we are embedded in, and that we sometimes can fleetingly feel or fleetingly available to us, but often are only semi-disclosed. And that our language that we use, regardless of what that language, sort of may be, whatever that discourse may be, is often lacking the terms for the relations that we must try and think, right? That we are in, but that we struggle to think. And so I wonder if you might just reflect very briefly on futurity and relationality, and your kind of ideas for where to go next, where to go now.
I mean, I think kind of this comes back to aesthetics to me, in terms of like, aesthetics is the sort of disclosure of a recognition of a relation that is kind of, that sort of pushes outside of a subject. So I don't know, so maybe in thinking about kind of futurity, and we think about the kind of paleo stories of kind of human journeys, and the kind of deep time, which is this very jagged rift of kind of precarious ways of fashioning the human, that it comes down in terms of my thinking to rethinking genealogy, because genealogy both precludes the orphan and the kind of orphan qualities of genetic inheritances, but also of experience, right? So the things that don't quite make it into that which doesn't survive or remains below the surface in a non-normative engagement. So thinking actually sort of with the orphan outside of a kind of family arrangement is in some ways a way to understand kind of or destabilize a notion of lineage or a notion of inheritance that has been so problematic in the establishment of privilege and racial privilege particularly.
Yeah. I just end up thinking like so much of the discourse of environmentalism, I mean, not all of it, but a lot, and of the Anthropocene and of climate change is about like, what about the future? What about future generations and the figure of the child? Like I was reading stuff on like people's descriptions of like the smoke here in the Pacific Northwest. And it's like invariably like my kid is not going to get the summers that I had. Okay. Which is like writing from a very privileged position. But it's always it's the figure of this child. I wonder if this turn to futurity maybe is limiting us in the present, and that maybe looking at what is actually happening in the present, as opposed to trying to open new futures, but to respond to in the present, might be the best way to open the new futures, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
just because this, I guess I'm thinking alongside Edelman, but because of the ways in which futurity has been so captured in reproduction and reproductive futurism and all, like, you know, as opposed to like attending to like who is here now, what is needed now. So I think that's it. I just like, my talk really started for me with just like the response of the university, of people being like, who cares? It's no big deal. Like, the future is going to come, like the smoke is going to go away, like let go of it, like it's fine. And I just like wanted to bring our attention to the present. And I feel like this getting over it, and this, like, you know, the discourse of resilience and sometimes even futurity is turning a blind eye to what's actually happening. Yeah.
Bad futurity.
I mean, of course we need a future. I want a future, but yeah.
Well, no, but so much of the present is semi-invisible to us, right?
Yeah,
That's the great challenge, right, of our kind of historical present, right, is the invisibility of the present, of so many different positionalities present, right? That's the, and we haven't really had time to talk about the multi-species, you know, questions in your talks, and the sort of the fleeting image of the absent hummingbird, right? But I think we're out of time, and so I want to thank you so much for this wonderful, engaging, and thought-provoking talk, which has been my great privilege to moderate. Thank you both.
Thank
you so much, both of you.
Yeah, same. Give me loads to think about. Thank you. All right.